Hey everyone, Morgan here. It's time for the last lab or exercise walkthrough. For this challenge exercise, you had to set up an environment for a highly available application. The application that you were setting up this environment for is the employee directory application. This is simply just a sample app that we provided to you through the user data script. So the steps that you had to go through to complete this lab was to first have the prerequisites of a VPC set up with the necessary requirements for a highly available environment. So we'll walk through that. Then you have to create a load balancer, a launch template, an auto scaling group, and then stress the application and watch the scaling happen. And then to do some cleanup at the end to delete everything that you had built here. So let's go ahead and jump into it. And the first thing that I want to do is show you the highly available VPC that we have. So I'm going to navigate to the VPC console. And then from here, I'm going to select VPCs. From here, I'm going to select your VPC. And this is similar to what you set up in Lab 2. So you can see here my CIDR range. I have my VPC. If I then go to subnets, we can see we have, let me expand this. There are 4 subnets that belong to this your VPC. So you can see that there in VPC column if I expand that. So we have 2 private subnets and 2 public. If I select the public subnet and then we can take a look at the route table, you can see that the route table has the local route, but it also has the route for the internet and the internet gateway. And this will allow internet traffic to flow through the internet gateway to these public subnets. So both of these public subnets have those routes in that route table. So that is looking good. And then finally, one more thing I want to show you that I had created before we started this lab is if I go to security groups and then I go to the security group that I'm going to use. This is a security group that I have set up for Lab 4 that I'm going to assign to the load balancer whenever I create it. So I created this ahead of time, just created a new security group, and I made sure that this security group was assigned to the VPC, your VPC. So, whatever your VPC name is. And then I have the inbound rules here, opening up port 80 and 443 to internet traffic. So that is something that's important for the application load balancer. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm going to go to the EC2 dashboard. And then from here, I'm going to create a launch template first. So this launch template, I'm going to click on Create Launch Template. And then I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call this Lab 4 template, and then give this a description. This is going to be for the employee directory app. And from here, I'm going to select the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. And then for the instance type, I'm going to select the T2 micro. For key pair, I'm going to say don't include in the launch template. And then for the network settings, I'm going to select VPC here. And then I'm going to leave the security groups one here blank, and I'll show you why in a second. I'm going to scroll down. Then I'm going to add a network interface. And under this network interface section here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this here, auto assign public IP. I'm going to change this to enable. And this is what this is going to do is this will actually assign a public IP to the backend instances. So you don't necessarily need to enable this because you're going to be accessing your instances through the load balancer. So technically you don't really need a public IP for some situations. However, our application is going to be downloading source code that is hosted externally on the internet. So I'm going to go ahead and enable this public IP here, and that will allow that request to go through. And then I'm going to select the Lab 4 autoscale or the Lab 4 ALBSG. This security group will apply to the instances and to the application load balancer. Again, this is mostly just for experimentation purposes, so that way I can reach the instances directly if I need to. I can kind of show you like how you can access the instance directly or through the load balancer. In the real world, you likely would just have your access come through the load balancer, and then you would have something like a NAT gateway that would allow that application to download any code from the outside. But just for simplicity for this specific lab, I'm going to go ahead and just open up the ports on that instance as well. Just, keep in mind that we are opening up those instances to the internet then for HTTP and HTTPS traffic. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up the advanced details down here. I'm going to leave most of this stuff exactly the way it is. However, I'm going to copy and paste. I have the instructions open in another tab here on another screen. I'm going to copy and paste the user data script. And this user data script downloads the source code here. And then it unzips it and installs it and installs all these different dependencies here. So this here, this is the part of the command that's like reaching out to the internet to download source code. So if you don't have your instance like able to access the internet and you don't have a NAT gateway set up or a NAT instance, then this will fail. So that's why I've opened up those ports and things like that earlier. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and double check everything we have just to do a quick run through. There we have Amazon Linux 2 AMI, T2 Micro, a VPC. We'll select the VPC that we're launching into later with the auto scaling group. I have down here, select a security group. I want to select this one. There we go, show all selected. Good thing I double checked. That one was not showing up before. Auto assign public IP to enable, and then keep scrolling down and we have our user data. Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and click create launch template. We can see that launch template has now been created. So now what I want to do is go back to the EC2 console and then scroll down on the left-hand side and click on auto scaling groups. Now, here's where I'm doing things maybe a little bit differently than the way you did it. It just depends on how you do it. You can create some of these things ahead of time, like the target group, the load balancer. You can create those ahead of time if you would like, or you can just come in here and you can create them as you go along. So this form here will help you kind of create this on the fly. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and name this Lab 4 Auto Scaling Group. And then the launch template, Lab 4 template, that's the one we just created. And notice here too how you have like versions. So there's two different things. And this is something like you see here, it says switch to launch configuration. There's launch templates and launch configurations. And launch templates allow you to have versioning, whereas launch configurations do not. So we used a launch template, and this is nice because then if you make changes, like let's say you didn't necessarily, it wasn't working for some reason, like maybe you forgot to assign the security group or something's not reachable, maybe you forgot the user data, you can go in and edit the launch template, and then you can just select the latest version, or you can select any other version at any other point. So that's pretty handy. Now I'm going to go ahead and click next. And from here, I'm going to leave the adhere to launch template, and then we get to select our VPC. I'm going to select your VPC and then the two public subnets. And this will launch our EC2 instances into those two public subnets. Also, these public subnets are in two different availability zones. So notice this one says US East 1B, and then the second one says US East 1C. These are two subnets are in two different availability zones. And that's going to be necessary for the load balancer to be directing traffic across the two availability zones. So that looks good. All right, then next, I'm going to say I want to attach to a new load balancer. So this is what I was saying before. You could attach to an existing load balancer, one you've created before, or you can create a new one right from this page. I'm going to select application load balancer. So because we are going to have a internet-facing load balancer that accepts HTTP and HTTPS traffic. And then you see here we have our subnets. We have our public subnets here. Both of them are selected. And then we also have our listeners. So we have port 80 listener opened. And then we want to click create target group. And then we can give this one a name here. I'm going to name this target group. And that will actually create the load balancer and the target group once we've created the auto scaling group. And then down here, I'm going to also check the box for ELB health checks. And then I'm going to go ahead and click next. For our group size, I'm going to put the desired capacity at 2, minimum capacity at 2, and then the maximum at 6. And so with this minimum capacity being 2, what's going to happen is once we create the auto scaling group, it's going to actually spin up 2 EC2 instances because right now we have no instances running. And so this auto scaling group is going to be created, and then it's going to realize like, oh, actually our minimum is 2. We currently have 0 in this auto scaling group. So let's launch 2, and it will launch 2 instances based off of the launch template that we just created. All right, so now under scaling policies, I'm going to pick target tracking, and then I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 50. So yeah, I'm just going to leave all of these as the defaults for now. So obviously, depending on your use case, you would change these to be whatever specific metrics, or like here, you can change the metric type here. You could do that if you want. We're going to go with CPU utilization because the application has like a stress feature built in that specifically spikes CPU. So, and that's also a pretty average metric to use for scaling. So it's not right for everything, but for this use case, it is. And then I'm going to go ahead and click next. Notifications, I'm going to click next, tags, next, and then we can review. So let's go ahead and review. We have our launch template. We have the network, our 2 subnets and 2 availability zones. We have our load balancer, we have the health checks, and we also have our group size, and we're going to be target tracking scaling on CPU utilization 50%. And then I'm going to go ahead and click create auto scaling group. All right, so this created the auto scaling group, and pretty soon this is going to be launching EC2 instances. However, before we go over there, I'm going to go into my load balancer. I'm going to make sure that this has the correct security group on it. So if I come here and I scroll down, we can see it just has the default security group. I want this load balancer to be accessible via port 80 and 443 for HTTP and HTTPS requests. So I'm going to also select Lab4 ALB SG. That's the one I showed you at the beginning of the video. Click save. All right. And now let's go ahead and go to the EC2 dashboard and then click instances. And notice how these are running and they are initializing. So these instances were just launched 11/24. You can see that's the time I have right now as well. So these just launched, and these are a part of the auto scaling group. So if I click on one of these, you can see we have a public IP address, a public DNS name. We can scroll down. We can see it's in our VPC, what subnet it's in. We can look at the security group, which is the one that we assigned. You can also see here what those rules are. You can see all sorts of information about these instances. So we're going to go ahead and give this a few minutes. I would say give this like 10 minutes to boot because it says that it's running. However, if I go and look at the actual like logs here, like let's say I go get system log, it's not actually even showing anything yet. So this means that this hasn't even executed or run our user data script yet. So we want to wait for that user data script to run. That's what's going to download the source code, things like that. So let's come back here to our instances, and then we will come back in a few minutes and see how this is all booting up. And we are back, and everything looks to be working well. I'm going to go ahead and select this first instance and then click actions, monitor and troubleshoot, and then get system log just to kind of show you like some troubleshooting so you know like what's going on the instance. So whenever the user data script runs, it's running all of those commands. And let's scroll up here. We can actually see some of them. There's one that I just saw. Scrolling down, there we go. Okay, see how this is like the Flask app? This is very recognizable. Here we go, wget, and then it's downloading the Flask app there. And then once it downloads, it unzips it, and then yeah, it goes through and downloads all of these dependencies and things. So if your user data script doesn't seem to be working, I would definitely come check this system log here, and you can get it just through the console. You don't have to log in or SSH into the instance. So that's just a little tip there. All right, so now instead of accessing these instances directly, I want to come through the load balancer. So I'm going to click on load balancing, and then I'm going to copy the DNS name and paste it up at the top and tack the /info on the end of the URL and click enter. So now you can see the instance ID and the availability zone that it's in. If I hit enter again, notice how the availability zone changed and so did the instance ID. right? I'm going back and forth between them. That's because the load balancer is balancing these requests across the two of them. So now the next task is we want to simulate scaling. So I'm going to go ahead and just stress the CPU for 5 minutes just by clicking this. You can see it says stressing CPU. So now we're going to wait for 5 minutes. I'm going to pause again, and then we'll come back and I will show you the scaling that has or has not occurred. We will find out when we come back. Right, and we are back. So just to kind of come back to the employee directory application here, I did refresh the page a few times and just click the stress button on each instance. And I clicked it a few times just to like really stress these instances out, and we could view the scaling. So now if we come back to the instances here, you can see now I have 4 instances running, and these 2 are still initializing. We can scroll over and see when they were launched, which was a minute ago. So these have been launched by the auto scaling group. So if I actually click on one of these instances, like let's select this one, and then I click on monitoring and kind of scroll down here, you can see the CPU utilization change here. See that? How it's like, it's actually pretty high there. You can see it goes up to like 80%. It's because I was like clicking, I clicked the stress button a few times just to kind of force it to be stressed out so we could view the scaling. So yeah, you can see that it worked, and we can see that the instances are launching. The auto scaling group is bigger. Eventually what's going to happen is that CPU utilization will go back down, and then 2 of these instances will be terminated. So yeah, the only thing left now is to delete everything. So something that you can do, an easy way to delete, go to your auto scaling group, and then you can just click on the auto scaling group and click delete there. Make sure that you actually delete the auto scaling group, because if you just delete the instances, the auto scaling group is going to notice that there's no instances and it's going to launch 2 more. So don't do that. Make sure you delete the auto scaling group first. This will actually delete the 4 instances. So you can see there we have 4 instances in this group. Make sure you delete that first. And then after that, you can go in and delete your load balancers. You can delete your VPCs, your subnets if you would like to, your target groups, all those sorts of things. But I did just want to quickly show you specifically, make sure you delete your auto scaling group. That is the most important thing here. Okay, that is it for this one. Thank you so much, and catch you next time.